Live.
Live, we're live. So hi guys, and welcome to the audience. This is Romantic Circles Pedagogies Hangout. And this is our very first Hangout, our very first attempt to bring together scholars talking about their pedagogy and the way that it has developed over time and how it intersects with both their scholarship, but also with their politics and all of the sort of interpersonal things that go along with it. And we have two wonderful scholars to talk with us today, and they're going to talk with each other. Anne McCarthy is assistant professor at Penn State, and Nancy Yousef is professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and Baruch College as part of the CUNY system. So the reason we had Anne and Nancy together is this part of our idea was to bring together scholars who had worked together, one as a mentor and the other as a mentee. So Anne had been, Nancy, is it right that you were Anne's dissertation advisor?
Yes. And
yes.
He was in many ways really my first graduate student.
Oh, wow, that's excellent.
From seminars through orals, through dissertation, through job market. So.
Oh, that's wonderful, wonderful. So we hit the jackpot here. So we're really excited, and I'm going to try to lay back as much as possible, just ask a couple of questions, and then allow you guys to talk. That's the way we see this working, and we're really excited, and we really want to thank you. Both Kate and I want to thank you for agreeing to do this. So, so I guess what I would do is first ask you to. Maybe when you each talk, you can identify each other, since I messed up and didn't put I didn't follow my own instructions and put the names there so people can see who we are. You can introduce yourself, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about your first interaction and what that was like for each of you.
Who's going to go first?
Well, you're big on my screen, so you should.
Now you're big on mine. We probably will have different memories of what our first interaction was, to be honest with you. I remember Anne being in the first graduate seminar that I taught at CUNY. So I had been at CUNY for some years before I started teaching graduate classes. And it was a very small class. I was new on the faculty. So I think there were only 3 people in the class. And they were all oddballs, different ways. But Anne was the one real student, and the first paper she wrote for me was, I thought already, kind of could have been written by an assistant professor, really theoretically sophisticated, and that was my first impression, and it became clear that I was really going to be teaching 3 different classes that semester to the 3 different students.
I mean, that was going to be my memory too, right? Being in that seminar of 3 people. Yeah, and sort of feeling like, some days it was just kind of our show. Which was okay.
Right. Well, the other person, one of the other people in the seminar was wonderful, wonderful guy in his own way. He was a poet and a musician, and he worked on Blake. And his ultimate dissertation was on Blake and Joni Mitchell.
Joni Mitchell, yeah.
He had a Joni Mitchell obsession, but so he was coming at things from a really sort of contemporary, creative angle. But he was wonderful. And then there was really somebody who, this class was almost like extension school. She was coming back to school after many years, and just was happy to be there, but.
Really wanted to talk about biography.
That's right.
Biographical criticism, and also the thing I remember was her telling me after I gave my presentation on the defense of poetry, which I was very into at that point. That was one of my high points with Shelley, as opposed to some of the low points I had with Shelley. But she's like, well, I just think deconstruction is a luxury of your generation. And I was very confused by that.
I don't remember her formulating a sentence like that, but I trust your memory.
That's like kind of burned into my brain, just for
Yeah.
the absurdity of it.
You know, ironically, the paper that you wrote in that seminar, which was a great paper, it was about Godwin's memoirs of Wollstonecraft.
Mm-hmm.
You actually, it was surprised me that that was where you chose to go in that last paper, because after a whole series of response papers that had been these very intensive close readings, you know, Derridian close readings of text and or Snoopy. So I was surprised that you actually went to biography. I mean, in your own way, but.
And the funny thing is, I'm still working on that paper. Like I was telling David before we got started, I sent a version of that to ERR, so I'm revising that right now, and still sort of trying to think through these issues and trying not to do the biography thing.
Right, right.
So I've always been sort of, I think, reading that biography against itself.
Yeah.
In a way. And the funny thing is, what's dropped out since 10 years when I wrote this paper.
You know, I would imagine it's
the
part
Derrida.
of the paper, but yeah.
Well, I mean, because I remember that was sort of my Spectres of Marx moment, and that sort of is no longer, mourning is no longer the thing that I'm most interested in.
Right.
So it's in some ways the explicit theory has dropped out in favor of trying to do this thing that actually is still really complicated and confusing, but maybe more kind of wrapped up with affect and emotion than it was at the time.
Can I ask Anne, what was Nancy like when you experienced her as a teacher in the classroom? Was she what was that like for you when you first encountered her?
Well, in some ways, I felt really lucky that it was such a small class and that I was the only person who at that point was in the PhD program in English. And so it did sort of feel like I was getting this like special sort of like advising thing. Looking back, I think I probably didn't totally grasp like just how difficult that seminar must have been to run. Because I've also, in my grad seminars here, I've ended up teaching some relatively small classes, but I can't have a class if there's less than 5 people. So, and even then, like, if somebody's absent or if somebody's not talking, it's really daunting. And I think that, now looking back, like, that was a super weird seminar. It was amazing. And it was one of those semesters where I think I was exclusively taking classes in 19th century British literature. So it was kind of a wonderful semester for me. And that way I wasn't working, but I also wasn't teaching. So that was like my one semester of like pure studenthood. But yeah, I can't imagine what it would have been to walk into that room as an instructor doing their first, having just kind of gone through the whole faculty membership thing.
Right.
To walk in there with this group of oddballs.
With the weird configuration. I will say that every seminar since then has been a breeze, just the dynamic, because there have been more, more students and a more coherent group. But that, it was the other thing that I did in that seminar, which I've never done since, is teach the entirety of Rousseau's Nouvelle Héloïse.
Right.
So I remember actually feeling that, if nothing else, for 3 weeks, I can talk about Nouvelle Héloïse.
I mean, I also think having designed these courses, to be spending 3 weeks of a grad seminar on one text and have it be that text is amazing. Like I've never had the courage to do that, or haven't yet. I did make my undergrad.
Do you do sort of text a week then? Is that what you do?
Kind of. Yeah, text a week, little sometimes supplemental things. There are a few things I've broken up over 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I really do a deep, I like at least 1 or 2 phases of the semester to be a really deep, sustained dive into something. I mean, Nouvelle Héloïse, it had to be that because it's so long.
Yes, yes.
But I mean, I'll do that with shorter texts too, 2 or 3 weeks, where we're not allowed to pretend that we're were more or less done after a
Mhm.
couple hours of discussion. And then things settle. Students come back with different questions, and
Well, your seminars are still 2 hours, right?
yeah,
3 hours. I do 3 hour seminars, so.
yeah, 3 might be different.
Also, sometimes I think doing some of these smaller texts and revisit them. Have maybe a main text for the week, and then that we
Right.
can circle around.
You've paused.
I did do this with.
Are you guys having the
lyrical
pause
ballads?
problem?
I put that did 1798 and then 1800 like 2 weeks later.
Hello.
Yeah, we lost Anne. We lost you. Oh, you're back.
Okay, but not moving. And am I here? I think I'm not here.
Well, I can hear you.
I can hear you too.
Okay. Can you see each other?
Yes.
I can't see me, but now I can. But now
Okay.
I can see Anne. It's so interesting. It goes back. No, now we're good.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So maybe
first.
What was that?
These are the virtues of being the first. The guinea pig.
Yeah, exactly. You get to work the kinks out. So I was going to ask, did you know that Nancy was going to be your advisor at that moment in that class? Did you ask her?
Well, I definitely knew she was going to be involved in some ways. It took me a few more years to realize I wasn't actually a Victorianist or exclusively a Victorianist. And so, there was a lot of, that was like a years-long negotiation. And really, in some ways, that wasn't even settled when I graduated. But it's become more settled in the last couple of years. But yes, I knew that. I knew I wanted Nancy involved in some way, probably a prominent way. And so, yes, I would say that I knew I couldn't get by on just Victorianists alone.
I think that's in some way. It's great for us as Romanticists, and somewhat unfortunate for the Victorian period. Anne really was working intensively on Victorian poetry. And so the romantic part was the background. And at the time, it was before a couple of retirements, there were excellent people to work on the Victorian poetry with. And, my husband's a Victorianist. I know the field fairly well. And one knows that it needs a theoretical approach would be really helpful. One knows and one imagines that there would be an audience for that. And it really turns out still not to be the case.
Right. It's hard to imagine. When I think about Anne, it's hard to imagine Anne as a Victorianist when I think about her work.
Well, there are going to be 2 chapters in my book on like the one that's coming out next year.
Right. I guess I mean that theoretically you seem to be grounded as a Romanticist.
Well, for a long time, when I was a grad student, I realized at some point that I only really self-identified as a Romanticist when I was around Victorianists. So it took me a while, I think, to kind of come into my own as like saying, yes, I am a Romanticist, and I'm willing to say that to other Romanticists. Although, what I appreciate is I never really felt pressure to choose. Right? Nancy always kind of was like, well, you can be this kind of Victorianist, you could be this kind of Romanticist, but never sort of was like, but you have to choose to be one. Right? Which I think was very lucky for me in a lot of ways, because it let me, kind of play at both roles. And then, through other, various other things, I began to be sort of more interpolated as a Romanticist. Like, I definitely felt that getting to Penn State, where there was a point where anytime anyone mentioned the word romantic, my one colleague would turn around and be like, what do you think about this? So I just kind of had to get used to that's the identity. But I do feel, especially sort of given all the pressures of advising and the job market and just grad student life, lucky to have not have to have made a really sort of clear-cut decision early on, because I don't think I would have been as good of a scholar of either one.
Yeah. I think there's 2 questions here. One is a question about professional identification and profile, and the other one is the scholarly or intellectual question. So I think something that your work and my work have in common is, my work more in recent years is a kind of long 19th century approach. And it makes absolute intellectual historical sense. I mean, something that exclusively Victorianist scholars don't tend to do is realize that really, really dig into the way in which the later 19th century is still processing, transforming, engaged with questions in Romanticism. So, so that project, that broad project of extending, sort of looking at romantic afterlife later in the century makes perfect sense. But that is a different, pragmatically, professionally, there's a question of who's your audience when you go to conferences, who are your interlocutors, who's going to be reading your dossier on the job market, who's going to be peer reviewing your articles. And in that sense, one does have to initially choose. And, it was clear because of your theoretical proclivities that you were going to have much more success as a romanticist, or just be more legible to romanticists.
Yeah.
That might not have always been the case, depending on the time that you went on the market, right, Nancy? Because it seems to me like Isabel Armstrong was someone who had that understanding of what you're talking about.
She still is, but she is the one, right?
The one, yeah.
There's always a few in the period, Amanda Anderson, there's always a few, but generally speaking, the approach is, it's not necessarily ideologically historicist. It can be in some cases, but it's culturally historicist. It's very theoretical. And frankly, Anne's approach and mine, we've been problematic in romantic circles too, as it's only in the last sort of 15, 20 years, I think, 15 maybe, that there's been a resurgence of sort of, we've been liberated to speak philosophically again after spending a lot of time talking about enclosure.
How did Anne, how did working with Nancy change the way that you teach?
Well, I think I just always wanted to be Nancy when I grew up. That's the easiest answer. I mean, I think that I very much am when I'm in a classroom, especially a graduate classroom, trying to sort of emulate the quiet brilliance that doesn't sort of like shut down everybody else in the room. Just kind of like opening things up with smart comments, spending time kind of dwelling on a close reading. That's at least what I'm aiming for. I don't know if I always get there, but that's definitely on my mind. And
that's so nice.
Nancy, have you thought about the ways in which having Anne has changed your pedagogy in any way, or working with her?
Well, Anne is the sort of model of, I mean, there are many brilliant students. I mean, but fortunately, many brilliant students. But Anne is a kind of model of like an engagement that has developed, that develops. So, in preparation for orals, I had more time in those days. I don't know where and how, but in preparation for orals, we had many meetings, many sort of tutorial meetings, more than I do now with students. And it was in part because there was something different going on in each meeting, a different kind of response to the text, and and an evolution in her thinking. So that's what I'm looking for. Like, I worry when I don't see that happening with students. So there's that. I mean, Anne was just a good model in terms of, this is ideally how development should proceed. And,
excellent. That makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that who you deal with as who you get as one of your first graduate students would affect a lot the way that you think about the way you teach graduate students, and would help to sort of form that.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say about Anne is that she listens to like professional advising, and it's a rare thing, because I think I remember as a graduate student not listening. I mean, not getting very much professional advising, but not listening. My identity was so bound up in what I was doing intellectually that I just couldn't grasp the practical matters as anything other than like horrible compromises. And Anne was just so clear-headed about it. And I hope you're that way with your students.
I tried, you know, I try to be. So, you know, we're a small group of romanticists here.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, I try to do things like say like, hey, here's the thing you need to do. You need to go negotiate for that, because we're a small, you know, then, you know, the nice thing about being in New York versus being in central Pennsylvania, of course, is that there's a lot of, you can just get by on just kind of showing up for things. In New York, whereas in central Pennsylvania, we are not experiencing a surefit of 19th century British talks events. So that's sort of, you know, with my grad students, I was like, let's go to this conference together. Why don't you meet this person? You know, just to try to get them to remember that this place is actually very tiny, and to be always kind of looking outward.
Right.
So I also wanted to ask, you know, because I'm trying to think how to formulate this. So Nancy, when I first met you, it was right around the time that your first book came out, and I was so impressed with that book. You do remember?
You were like my first fan, I think.
So yeah, that book was so excellent. And so, but one of the things that I remember and have since sort of admired about you is your sort of strong intellectual presence, and the kind of quiet listening that we've heard about. And so I wondered about, in terms of teaching, how each of you negotiate gender in the classroom, and how that sort of plays out, and what maybe you've learned from one another about that. And maybe you each have to do it a little bit differently, but I wonder if you would say something about that.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the more interesting questions that you posed, because it's I confess I hadn't thought deeply about it directly. I'm a small person physically, and I'm not very femme, you know. I mean, I still dress the way I did as a grad student. So I think that is one approach I think that women professors take, is to really play up and perform the femininity, just have it out there. I tend to try to be, I can't be gender neutral, right? I can't disguise how small I am. But it's, you know, it's something that I kind of want off the table as soon as possible in terms of, so one thing I found, I don't think I've done this consciously, but my classes tend to start with some philosophical text, you know, on the first day, either a bunch of excerpts or a philosophical reading. And I think that's scary to guys. You know, I think it establishes, like from the outset, a certain degree of authority. And then we move on from there. And I hadn't realized, I think that might be an unconscious strategy for dealing with gender. And with my undergraduates, it's a really different story. You know, I'm often teaching novels. The novels are very, you know, they're chick lit in a certain way. And I just am explicit about it. I'm like, hey guys, you know, did you ever think you'd be so fascinated, you know, and engage them openly in the fact that, you know, they might feel awkward, or they're not expected to be obviously interested. And so to be upfront about it, I guess. So that's not a great answer, but
no, it is good. Anne, what about you?
Well, I think I do. I played up the femininity thing a lot more when I didn't have to teach 3 days a week in winter. And then there's this, a certain point about 2 weeks in where it's like, okay, just wearing the pants and the snow boots. So that, that has been tempered. So I guess maybe I'll start with undergrads and like work back to graduate students. I will say I did teach classes on romantic women writers, both undergraduate and graduate, last fall. So it was definitely there it was very much on the table. And my version is a little bit like Nancy was saying, hey guys, doing this. Mine's more like, oh, and am I right, ladies? All we want to do is find that husband. So that's I think that's sort of what I was, what my approach was. But of course, that also meant that I was teaching classes on women writers during the election. And that was interesting, to say the least. I will say this actually does go back to something that we read in Nancy's seminar the first time. I taught Sense and Sensibility that semester. And I remember just thinking back when you read that in Nancy's class, why are we reading Jane Austen? This is so but it really made sense. I was rereading it the weekend after the election. I might have written some obscenities in the margins. like, why did I think this was a student text 10 years ago? This is amazing.
Yeah.
So, are we all getting feedback?
I'm getting feedback.
Okay, so maybe.
Oh, okay.
Just gonna. We'll see.
Oh, should I turn your phones now too?
It might help. It might help.
It is helping for me, I think.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Excellent.
If we need them. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So you brought it up, Anne, and it's a big question in the room, and it is now, the middle of May or towards the end of May of the first year of a new presidential, has that changed your experience in the classroom, and if so, how?
Well, I think when I was in the middle of this women writers class, it was complicated because most of these novels turned out to be about things like sexual assault. And that's especially I think every college campus, but especially Penn State, there's a lot of energy and anxiety around that. So already it was sort of like a weirdly charged space. It was the first time I'd ever taught a class where I was like, I should maybe just put a heads up about content here. Just, not like a full on trigger warning, but just so this is what you should expect. Like, don't expect that this is not going to be there just because it's 18th and 19th century literature. So that was kind of already in play. And then, sort of towards the end of that semester when the election happened, I finally just sort of, decided I was going to go into class and be like, everybody is kind of exhausted. I knew I had Trump supporters in the class. At least one woman who had told me as much in office hours, right after the election.
Right.
So I just had to kind of figure out a way to be like, we can all take things from these texts. We're all exhausted. This is all terrible. That was sort of the best I could do then. And with my grad students, who I was also teaching a version of this class too, for them, I just was trying to help them negotiate how present they needed to be for their own students. And also to say, you don't you're not their only professor. You can have space for your reactions too. There's no one right way to respond.
Right.
And we were also, it was also kind of the gender dynamics of our department were also very charged around this, I think, just with the ambient noise. So I think just trying to model, especially for my female grad students, just here's one way to deal with it. And just trying to be a model, here's the boundaries I'm setting. Here's where I'm letting sort of impersonality be a thing that maybe students want. Because I think we had a lot of pressure, I think, just to be like, well, everyone needs to talk about their feelings. And I was kind of like, I think that's a go-to in a lot of these sort of seminars on how to deal with it. But I also And I think that I came out of that whole semester feeling really strongly that sometimes allowing students the opportunity not to talk about their feelings is really important, especially I think given just, you know, the subjects that we teach. I think if they want to just escape into a Jane Austen novel in that situation, they can. I mean, I will come in and be like, this novel is a horror story, but I will also let them kind of do their thing and not feel like that they have to be sort of like called up to be like, tell me how you're feeling right now. You know, just, I think there's ways to, you know, have more, you kind of work those reactions through a text and through interactions or through not interacting. Right. Like allowing that to be an option.
Interesting. I actually found myself wondering, you know, immediately after the election, when there was a lot of, you know, we must meet, we must talk, whether that was not coming more from, you know, from our side of the, rather than from the student side of the classroom. So that's interesting. I cannot imagine what it would have been like to have Trump supporters in my classroom. I'm so glad that I'm in New York and that was, you know, not there. In the fall, I was teaching an undergraduate class in the 19th century novel, and while the election was going on, and I must say could not have been more shocked, right, at the outcome of the election. But what I found throughout the semester is that we were talking about economic questions in those texts more than you know, more than I ever had. You know, really interested in class, transmission of property, merit, critiques of the merit system, the legal system, the injustice in the legal system, and the way the novel, you know, because Victorian England, you know, is, you know, we're ever more like it, you know, closer and closer to child labor and indentured servitude and things like that. So, so I thought that was our way of, it was our way of addressing issues that were very much present in the presidential debate. And then this spring, I'm teaching, you know, in the graduate seminar that I'm teaching, you know, many of us, I mean, I'm sure you felt the same way. It was impossible. It felt impossible to walk into the seminar room and say, we're going to think about Wordsworth with everything that was happening. So, and, you know, I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that I found it difficult. And we spent some time maybe in the first class. I think I jiggered up what I was doing in that first class to allow me to sort of say something about what I thought in some distant way the stakes were politically in the topic, you know, having to do with authentic speech and taking speech seriously and taking language seriously. But it's been, you know, therapeutic for me to be doing that class this semester.
Right. No, I taught Jane Austen as well. And, you know, for me, it was much like what Anne said, just if I had the text between us, once the text was between us, it created a really wonderful opportunity for, and I have Trump supporters for sure in my classroom, and I ask them as much as possible. I mean, this is just me, but they bother me less than some of my other students. And I try to draw them out as much as possible when we're in the classroom, but usually in the context of talking about a specific aspect of the text. And I usually find it really helpful, and my students do too, that we don't pretend that there's nothing going on outside the classroom walls, or that we're not engaged in other things. And we also have tons and tons of foreign students here, and students who were affected by the travel ban, et cetera, as you both do, I'm sure. But so I'd like to, maybe we're sort of winding down a little bit. So I have two sort of final questions, if that's okay. The first question comes from Kate Singer. She sort of proposed this as a sort of question we might ask each time we do one of these Hangouts, or we'll see how it goes. But I think it's a lovely question. It's sort of, it made me think. I wondered if each of you think that you teach a romanticist pedagogy or a romantic pedagogy? And if so, what does that mean to you? And if you'd mind commenting on that a little bit. Who wants to go first on that question?
Okay, I would actually give this question a bit of thought in relation to, there was another question about the place of theory and in teaching. And, you know, I realized, you know, I very rarely actually teach theoretical texts. They're rarely the primary thing that we're doing in a class. But what I decided was the romanticist aspect of the pedagogy is it's not only close reading, but a certain form of close reading in which so much pressure is being put on terms, key terms in a text, that to the point where hopefully we realize that those key terms, you know, nature, mind, imagination, whatever, you know, whatever they might be, sometimes simple ones, sometimes, you know, grammatical forms, that they need to be thought about, you know, with a certain degree of specificity every single time they appear. And Anne's work, you know, Anne spent a lot of time thinking about the willing suspension of right. I guess I think about the willing suspension of signification or something. That's that there's a process, like we have to go through various attempts at coherent readings in order to, you know, become comfortable with the uncomfortable fact that a non-synthesis is a more interesting place to end up.
Oh, that's excellent. Anne?
Well, it's funny because it becomes often, certainly with this semester, was a running joke in my undergraduate romanticism course that I didn't like them just throwing around the word nature. And you know, so I even, like, on one of the files, someone was like, well, caution, I'm going to use the word nature, Professor McCarthy. But I mean, for exactly the reasons that Nancy was saying, right? Like, you know, sometimes I do challenge them, like, okay, talk about expostulation and reply without using the word nature. Like, if I just didn't let you use that word, what would you think? You know, how would you tell me about this poem? So I think, you know, we're definitely on the same page with that one. I will say, I do think my undergrads think that, you know, I do occasionally think that they think that I'm just like a romanticist professor out of a movie. I do not stand on tables, but I feel like I've had students say, you're a true romantic. I think I'm not always sure what they mean by that. I think it could just be a lot of like, I just come into the room and start, you know, spontaneously reading things, which I do on the first day of class. I just, without any preamble, just start talking about Kubla Khan. You know, like, it's 1797 and we're in this cottage. So I think that, you know, just, and there is a sort of performative aspect to what I do. And I do try to embody that in ways that are hopefully, you know, entertaining to undergrads, but also kind of draw them in a little bit and make them want to do things like not use the word nature in a way that's irresponsible. We also, of course, spend a lot of time talking about the sublime, which they love. Then I have to pull them back. It's like, okay, you can, all those things can't be sublime, you guys. So, but it is interesting to see. I mean, one of the things I like is the exchange of the undergraduate classroom when you just see sort of the way that they pick up on things that I'm saying. You know, I might have described some poets as having all the feels, and, you know, but I can tell that they're using that, you know, when they use that back to me, they're doing it with enough ironic distance, which I do think is a weirdly sort of like continuing romantic, like we're continuing to invent something. And for various reasons, this past semester, I did a lot less like intensive preparation than I usually do. I mean, I'd read most of the things. It was a very similar syllabus to when I'd taught. But in some ways, I think that was also part of the thing, right? To be able to come in and say, okay, here's what I think is interesting. What do you guys want to look at? And then building something out of that.
Those are great. Thank you, guys. Those are wonderful answers. And it reminds me, of course, of sort of reminds me of Spivak's sort of pushing towards thinking about a romantic pedagogy, and that's excellent. So as we wrap up, I wanted to know if there's any like things that you guys wanted to sort of close out with, a story, something about your sort of interactions, etc. I wanted to say one thing, that it strikes me that Anne, you're an excellent student insofar as you didn't, you as much as you want to be Nancy when you grew up, you also seem to resist that desire to want to be Nancy when you grow up, which is really wonderful. I had a very powerful dissertation advisor myself, and it was very hard for me to resist wanting, you know, to be Marjorie, because but it was very important that I did it and that I do it. I continue to resist. So I just wanted to comment that I think that's a beautiful melding that you guys have. And so far as you have both, you still continue to want to be her, but you also resist that desire, and which is really beautiful. So anything, last thoughts or ideas or questions that we didn't get to, things you've been thinking about as we've led up to this?
Well, I would just say, in addition to really finally coming around to an appreciation of Sense and Sensibility, and finally realizing after 10 years why this book was worth reading and teaching, the other thing I've come around to since I started teaching a lot of Romanticism classes is Wordsworth. I may have said some nasty things to Nancy back when we were having all those meetings for my orals about Wordsworth and human suffering and things, but I have to say, like, I really appreciate Wordsworth a lot more. You know, when I'm when I'm drawing stick figures to represent Tintern Abbey on the board and working through that with my students, I have finally, I don't hate Wordsworth anymore. Let's just say that.
Right. I look forward to actually the time when, you know, I can teach Shelley. I haven't taught Shelley in a while, but I think your work on Shelley is gonna help me. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm just looking forward to your book coming out, and I'm really
So am I. So am I.
I'm really super proud. I mean, I was thinking that time accelerates, and so this is an odd thing to confess, but I think that I was in the very early stages of pregnancy during my first seminar with you. And my daughter's now 10. And so time seems to, I know, but you say that, but you know, time seems to really slow down in graduate school. But to think of you, you know, like having been in a job for a few years and on the verge of
5 years.
and on the verge of publishing your first book, and knock on wood, getting tenure. 10 years is actually lightning speed. You know, that's amazing.
Well, on that note, maybe we will conclude. Thank you guys so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And we should once again wish happy birthday to Anne.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let's hope we all see each other at Nasser.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.